Welcome back, everyone, and hello to everyone that's just joining us. I am Deborah Kendall. I am the founder and CEO of YSYS, which is a startup community supporting diverse talent to kickstart their careers in tech and launch startups. I'm super excited to be here. Is everyone else excited? Yeah, whoop, whoop. I just want to give a massive thank you to our sponsors, Accenture, Visa, BT, and Quantum Black, which are helping us put together this amazing hybrid experiment of a tech event. So big up to CognitionX and our sponsors. I also want to get everyone to hype up and welcome our moderator and our speaker as we explore data, sustainability, and so much more. So this is your cue to go. And can we just give them a massive round of applause as well before they start?
Thank you. Thank you. Hi there. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Planet and Smart Cities track, whether you're joining us virtually or in person today. Thank you for being here with us. My name is Jessi, Lennard. I work at Visa, and we are delighted to be sponsoring this panel discussion today on data-driven insights for sustainability. Visa is working really hard, and I mean everybody at Visa, for a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable world for people, for businesses, for economies, and for society, but also especially for our planet. We know that it's a huge challenge for global society. We know we really have our work cut out for us. With temperatures around the world at all-time highs, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, these are not easy challenges to solve by any stretch. And every year it's becoming clearer that we are exceeding the carrying capacity of our planet. Thankfully, we have reason to believe that this really will be the decisive decade for tackling climate change. As we come out of COVID and we go into recovery, we hear more and more about Build Back Better. We hear about green recovery. And we at Visa are certainly very optimistic that that's what we need and that's what we're going to have. Now, we're here today to talk particularly about one asset that Visa believes very passionately could be a powerful tool in tackling some of these challenges, and that's data. So we've been actively exploring the potential of Visa data, that's transaction data, payments data, across our global network to drive some valuable insights which could help us in this endeavor. So we're looking, for example, at macroeconomic insights that we can glean from across Visa's global data sets that could be helpful to businesses, to policymakers, to public sector organizations. Everything from commercial strategy and growth, risk management, through to planning smart cities, EV charging networks, even where you site stores in these new, more sustainable cities and consumer journeys that we're all on. So we're very excited about this. We're working with some of our great partners on this panel, our friends at Cambridge. We're exploring the bigger picture about sustainability transformation. Our fintech partner here at Ecolytic, who's helping us look at, on a transaction by transaction basis, how we can empower consumers with more knowledge and more understanding of the carbon content of their transactions, enabling them to make greener choices. We're very excited to have with us today here a fantastic panel, and this is one of the best parts of my job. Working for a business which is at the heart of a global payments ecosystem, we can pull together people from across our network who care passionately about these issues, who have deep expertise, and who could join us in conversations like this one today. So it's my privilege to start the conversation. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves in the interest of time as I ask our first question. Thank you all for being here today with us, and thank you for your partnership. So I'm going to ask Alvaro first. All of you on this panel represent very different parts, I think, of the potential solution here and different ways of using data. You all have very diverse perspectives. Could you tell me a bit, Alvaro, about the parts of data use that you're most excited about, and give me some real-life examples of how you're using data for sustainability transformation in your organization today?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Jessica. Well, a short introduction. My name is Alvaro Fernandez. I am the head of data models in Santander, Spain. And yes, we've been working a lot in sustainability projects with data. In fact, we've launched a project related to individuals, another one related to corporate customers. For example, in the case of individuals, we've been analyzing more than 1 billion card transactions in order to create a carbon scoring algorithm to show every individual customer the emissions in the mobile app. So this is a very interesting project in order to raise customer awareness about climate change. And in fact, it's a really big data project in terms of the huge amount of data that we are analyzing for this project. But we are not only using this for individuals, we are also very interested in companies. And in this case, what we are trying to do using these new data sources, in this case, internal and transactional data sources, is to measure the environmental impact of every corporate customer. In this case, for example, there is a direct impact in our risk policies because we are taking into account these environmental impacts in order to make our risk decisions. So it's very important for us to have a very good profile for each customer of the environmental footprint. In this case, we started with an aggregated classification based on economic activities, but we have been able to translate this aggregated number into individual emissions for each customer in order to use this into our risk engines and to do the right risk decision for each customer. So we are analyzing a huge amount of data, and I think it's a really interesting project.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And those are two very different examples there that you've given us to kick us off. I think if I can come to David next, who I suspect is going to zoom in on one of those examples that he's very passionate about.
I would love to. So thank you very much for having me. So I'm David, co-founder of the non-for-profit organization for sustainable consumption and also co-founder of Ecolytic. And we are actually taking the consumer side. So we are analyzing payment transaction on the consumer end and trying to help consumers understand their environmental impact. And we're particularly sourcing scientific data around the world and really trying to figure out what is the purchase that I just did having for an influence on the environment, and helping consumers that way to understand, first of all, what is my role and what can I do better. And I think this is very fascinating because I think we all stumbled over there and saying we want to do our part in fighting climate change, but the reality sometimes is really hard to figure out where can we start and what is actually my role. And that's what we try to solve here.
And David, can you give us an example of the sort of action and insight link that a consumer might make? So you give them an insight around data. What sort of action might you then anticipate that they take?
So I think, especially in the world, we think there are three types of action the consumer can take. First of all, it's the hardest one is a behavioral change. So if I know, for whatever reasons, I should cut down my meat consumption or travel more with public transport, I can do so. But obviously, I need to change my habits, and that's kind of the hard part. The second part is obviously if I emit emissions, then I can kind of do the shortcut and start offsetting for it. That helps already by planting trees or financing school and education initiatives, etc. And I think the third part is investing my money into the right directions. So, for example, we need to do much more on the mobility side. We need to do much more on renewable energies. And by putting the money where it matters, I can actually have a huge influence. So it's always those three pillars. It's basically behavioral, it's offsetting, and it's investing. And
you think that the data insights can be a trigger to nudging those behaviors?
Absolutely, because knowing, going shopping, or ask yourself if you want to know how much do I emit on a personal level, then often we can only compare ourselves to some numbers we have known, but it doesn't really reflect our personal lifestyle. And look at my bank account, that usually knows everything, right? I know how much rent I pay, or if I have a house and mortgage to pay. I know where I go out. Not so much lately, but hopefully soon again. And if I have a car, so everything that combined gives me a very good picture of what is my influence. And knowing that, and then diving deeper and saying, you know what, I probably could take the train once more instead of flying. Or if I fly, you know what, I really had to do this trip. Let me offset it for a few pounds. So it becomes more easy to really act on it, and just by knowing what actually my influence is.
Speaking of taking the train or flying, Thomas, let's hear a different sectoral perspective. We've heard a bit about banking. Tell us about transit and mobility.
Yes, thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you for having me in this panel today. I'm Thomas Deloison, and I lead the mobility program at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We are a not-for-profit organization that is gathering 200 of the most forward-thinking CEOs of the biggest corporations of the world to advance the topic of sustainability. In the transport space, sustainability essentially is starting to be relying around a very simple narrative. It's about decarbonization that is obviously going to be leading to a faster adoption of electric vehicles or zero-emission vehicles. And with that, of course, comes the charging infrastructure and the need to somehow look at digitalization and data to aggregate all these services together and make sure that we can develop or deploy this technology at pace. The second key element of the narrative of the way forward is really about digitalization, where we see a lot of these solutions for sustainable mobility that are relating to digitalization and data sharing. And if we look at the figures, I mean, we know that we have to improve the efficiency of transport, passenger transport overall, by 30% in the next decade, if we want to be on track with the net zero scenario. So it is essential that we consider digitalization and data in particular to achieve this objective. And the final one, which is very much what David was talking about, we have to look at ways to embrace these technologies and somehow change our behavior. And there, in transport, obviously, multimodality is one of the key areas where cities and governments, but also the private sector looks at. We've recently just done a study that's showing that mobility as a service, so the application that essentially offers multimodality, could help to improve the CO2 efficiency of passenger transport between 5 and 20%, depending on the region and depending on the legacy. So there is really a lot at stake by, I would say, fostering the capacity for data sharing and leveraging digitalization for sustainability.
Thank you so much. And thank you for raising data sharing. We're going to come back to you on that one. And finally, to Ben, can you give us a macro view? I know a lot of the work that you do at CISL is around systems transformation, and you have this fantastic global perspective due to the businesses you work with and the sort of work you do. Can you take us up and give us that God's eye view of what's going on at systems level and how data interplays with that?
Thanks, Jessi. Yeah, sure. And great to be with you. So for those of you who haven't come across us, I've worked with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We're part of the university. We've been around 30 years, probably best known for executive education, but we also work in sustainable finance. We look at the whole sort of regulatory and policy side to create a sustainable future, and also looking at what the role of business is. How do we transform businesses so they can play their role in a sustainable future? So I think some of the insights, Jessi, what we know as a sort of NGO and academic communities, we know what systems need to change to create a sustainable future, the Sustainable Development Goals for shorthand. We know that it's around food, it's around mobility, it's around resource use and keeping it circular, and energy, and in increasingly urban context. And we know that finance and digital are critical enablers of that sort of transition. The question that's not clear is how do we do that? Because that is complex, it's uncertain how those systems will transform, but they need to transform because either in order to decarbonize, as Thomas has described, requires huge transformation of those systems. If they don't transform, they're going to be hit and impacted by the growing impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. So either way, we're facing huge transition. If we think about the role of digital and data, I mean, if you take ICT as a whole, there was an interesting report done by Jessi called Digital with Purpose. We work with them. And it suggested in that report that ICT and digital generally can help decarbonize by 9% of global emissions. So we're talking about a huge step change potentially. And that around $3 trillion of R&D is going into ICT in the next decade. So it's a question of where do we point that in direction and what does that do? They also suggested there were kind of 4 key roles that, if you like, digital can play. The first is around connecting and communicating both people, ideas, opportunities, and is a really important role to play. Also, it's about monitoring and tracking the world around us in order to understand where those impacts are, in order to really target interventions and where changes needs to happen. Another really important role is to analyze and optimize different processes and systems to make sure they're really operating very efficiently and so on. And then the fourth and final role is around, if you like, human augmentation and also automation So really helping that sort of creating sort of positive impacts. And so they're the roles. And you can see how data insights can really cut across all four of those to a greater or lesser extent. So I think the opportunity is huge. Equally so is the uncertainty. But I think equally the jury's out at the moment. It could go either way. It's also possible that the role of digital and ICT could make things worse. It could create rebounds effect and if you like, augment a lot of the negative trends. So the jury's out. So I think there's a real opportunity, to make sure we take this in the right direction and then create a future that works for everybody.
Ben, you've led me very smoothly into my second question, which is around the challenges. So all of the panelists have given us, I think, some fantastic examples and some great vision about where we could go. But you quite rightly say these are two very, very complex things. Data and decarbonization, huge, complex things that we're dealing with here. And I want to come back to Thomas about something he said on data sharing. Now, we know that there are potentially multiple challenges to making data and decarbonization and sustainability transformation work together. Data sharing is one that I know you and I have discussed before. How do you see that as playing out as a particular challenge?
Yeah, definitely a fundamental challenge. And I would say the prime capacity, to pick on the words from Ben, to achieve these two levels of the framework: monitor and track and analyze and optimize, which are essential to transport. I think there are probably two levels of challenges. The first one is anything related to interoperability, the infrastructure, the ways that the private sector and the public sector essentially have to find the means to make it happen really practically. And with that, of course, the immediate questions of the revenue models, and because generating data has a cost, and it has a cost which is financial, but it also has, by the way, an environmental cost. And more, we are also being aware of the social cost that data and digitalization has. So I think it's absolutely essential that we create this capacity at this, I would say, ground level to handle digitalization and establish those sound governances. And these are absolutely essential because these are at the core of the ability of each of the sectors to create trust, which is so important in gaining the ability for the public, the users, to actually share their data. So really, the idea of governance is centric in digitalization. And that leads me to this second level of discussion in terms of challenges. Now we step away from kind of the operational level. We look at industry level, at city level, and at government level, where it's absolutely essential that we very quickly find the means to enable these governances that I've talked about, so that they deliver on a shared value, a value that is both environmental, social, and economical. And for that, I mean, as an organization that gathers the biggest industry players in the world, clearly for us, the challenge is to push the industry to break the trust barrier. There has been too many examples of private sector operators, private companies that are recently have been leveraging digitalization and their skills for probably monopolistic behaviors with detrimental impact on other areas. And I think we need to break that right away, so that to provide the industry with the means to align their activities to what the public wants. It's about sharing a vision. Like Ben said it, we are all in it. We have to basically collaborate for this huge transformation for decarbonization, but also the elements that are coming with it related to inclusivity, so that we achieve this transformation in a way that is simply sustainable. So private sector must align its intentions to these visions so that the public and the private sector can share a common ambition and start to collaborate under these governances, which will obviously be contextual, local, depending on the laws, but they have to anyway guarantee a certain level of operation in terms of security and in terms of privacy.
Thomas, I think what's fascinating about what you're saying is the applicability of that to so many of the goals that we have with data. I can absolutely see what you mean about we have to do these things in order to get the success out of the sustainability goals with data. But I think what you're saying is really applicable to so many of the things that we want to achieve with data. If we don't have governance, if we don't have security, if we don't have trust, if we don't have inclusivity, the entire data project fails, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and these will be the expectations under which everyone is going to be judged by the public, by the final users, you, me, and others who will have to click, I agree, I want to share my data.
Yeah. Can I come to Alvaro? Alvaro, what particular challenges have you experienced? What are the barriers to achieving some of the goals you talked about earlier?
Yes, I think we are facing two challenges, one related to data. In the case of Spain, at least, there is a limitation of public information on climate. There is a shortage of data and even low quality. And in some cases, this data is highly aggregated, and it's really difficult to use it in order to put this into your models. So I think there is an opportunity if we work with the public sector here in order to get this open data environment, in order to be able to join the internal data that we have the banks about the customer in an anonymized way with this public information in order to have a better understanding of the environmental impact of our customers. We are doing some advanced analytics with internal data, but this external data, external public information is something that we are facing a real challenge because here in Spain, some local administrations are opening the data, but some others not. And this is a problem for us. So I think our first challenge in this case is this external data and public information is very difficult to join with our internal information. And in the second place, I would say that this is a very complex problem. So, for example, we are trying to model the home efficiency of our customers, analyzing, for example, the energy consumptions or any other transactional information that we may have. And what you find is in some cases things that you don't expect. For example, more efficient houses have a higher energy consumption, just the opposite that you could expect. And when you are developing these models, you find that there are a lot of additional factors that you have to take into account in order to really understand the environmental impact of this family, because maybe there are some factors that you are not taking into account. So for me, this is one of the most, I do a lot of models. I do risk models, I do commercial models, I do models for every department in the bank. But for me, this is by far the most complex, because of these direct effects that you may think are between energy and efficiency. You don't find this in an easy way. You have to do a lot of analytics in order to estimate the real impact and the real situation of each of your customers.
Thank you so much. You're painting between you and Thomas. From Thomas, I'm hearing governance and interoperability. From you, I'm hearing quality and potential accuracy issues from knowing that you may have missing, incomplete data sets. And I can absolutely understand how problematic that can be. And talking to a lot of the data scientists in all of our organizations, certainly the concern at the moment around that incomplete data and the effect that has on the accuracy of models that we're all building in this space is a very real concern. Can I come to David finally? Now you're dealing with consumers, which might be the trickiest part of all of this. What are the challenges and barriers that you faced at Ecolytic?
I think it's pretty much the same. It's the availability of data. It's the accuracy. It's the validation of data. So if we got data, where are they coming from? Who has actually crunched them? Where are they? What's the methodology behind it? So I think it's always the same problem. And I think what we need there is a bit more standardization on certain levels, and especially if we look now, we have over the last, I think, 16 years, we have input-output models, but they are not relevant for consumers because we're looking at industries. And for me as a consumer, it's glad if I know how much the, finance industry is actually polluting or emission, but I actually don't know what my bank account is doing with it. Same with meat, right? So I don't know it's glad if I know how much meat production is actually contributing overall, but what is the steak on my plate now doing? And there's a lot of missing information. And if there are studies out there, then they're often country-specific or individual cases, so they cannot be applied on a broader scale. And I think that's again a problem of availability and accuracy on the data. That's something that we urgently need to solve.
So I'm going to immediately flip now, David, and stay with you because you've started talking about solutions. So I'm going to stay with you for my final question. And I like this as a final question because it means we get to end on a positive note. So you started talking about solutions there. From your perspective, what are the most important things that we can do to make tangible difference from where we are today with some of these barriers and challenges to where we need to get to?
Start working together. I think collaboration is the key, and that means sharing data. And I think one of the problems that we have over the last 20 years, we're talking about digitalization, how we can do this, and we're switching fax to email, and now email to something else, whatever. And let's face it, only few companies in the world have actually understood the concept of data and what we can do with it. But a lot of, if you ask people out there, it's like, yeah, data is the new gold. That's true in sustainability, but only if we share it. If we keep them to us, they're worthless. And I think that's a key fundamental. That means it doesn't matter what you do. Start sharing what you have and what you're obviously allowed to on not breaking any laws, but start sharing it. And even if it at the first step makes you a little bit vulnerable, that's completely normal because, your competitor could look at the data and saying, whatever, or, you're actually not so sustainable as you claim to be, but then the competitor is forced to publish their numbers as well, right? And so suddenly we're getting more and more and more numbers and we're starting a discussion. And then we have the availability. We still need to solve the accuracy and the validation, but we need to get the data on the plate in order to actually get something moving. And I think that's just something that we all can do. So in terms of sustainability, data is only valuable if we share it. And I think that's good. That's a good news. And if we all start doing it, we're almost there.
Thank you very much for that positivity and energy as an end note. Alvaro, can I come back to you? What do you think we need to do?
Well, I think in our case, we are a result-oriented company. What we are trying to do from the first day is to prove that these projects create a lot of value. So this is not a long-term project like an innovation one. No, this is a project with a short-term value for the business, because this is not something. This is a project that we are not only doing from an ethical perspective, but because it's a really commercial opportunity for us, for the bank. I could give you numbers about the lower cost of credit, for example, of financing these kind of projects versus other ones. So this is a real value for the business, and also it's a real value for the society. So it's a win-win for everyone. And this is part of a green revolution that we are being part with a real impact. And I think the best way to move forward is to prove that this has a real impact in the short term. And this way we will be able to go on with the project. So yes, I think the best way to move is proving results in the short term.
I think it's fantastic to hear from the finance sector with such positivity on this, because it's not always the first sector everybody thinks of when they think of sustainability transformation. So to hear that from you and to hear you think there is a value proposition here and you've got the data to prove it is incredibly positive. I want to come to Thomas, because I know that Thomas' organization is actually doing some really, really interesting work here in how we can potentially refine some of these models which help us to look at the carbon content of products and of transactions. Thomas.
Yeah, indeed. We are very active on the topic of data sharing and across mobility or carbon transparency. And we always find a little bit the same pattern. We find a big ambition, a big intention that we all strive for. And indeed, when we start to get into the details, when we start to get into the ground level work, there's always a lot of questions and a lot of blocking points. And so there would be a couple of things that I would like to suggest so that we move forward. I think, indeed, it's very often about proving the value of data. And David, thank you so much for putting the word out there. Data has no value if it's not shared. That is as simple as it is. Secondly, we need to start sharing. And for that, we need to embrace these governances that I've been talking about in a flexible way. It will be about protecting privacy and security in any sort of ways, and then adopt flexible means of governing the data, for what, used by who, etc., so that it can evolve over time, because we will not get it right first time. Then I think the private sector has a big role to play. We need to aggregate these intentions, and I'm so glad to hear companies like Santander, yourself, Ecolytic, or even Visa, basically sharing these views and starting to embrace the journey of declaring your intentions as companies to share the data that you have for greater good. And with that, I think we can signal really strongly the need for ambitious policies that allow for this data to finally start to be shared, to the training to happen, the education, the communication to the public. And there we will start to see the system changing slowly.
Systems change. Ben,
So
take us home.
So I think probably two things, building very much on what the panel have said. I think the first is, because a lot of these systems are fragmented and complex, it means that I think it's the Euros. I'm going to use a football analogy. People need to come off the sidelines and get onto the pitch. And also we need to shift from a solo sport to a team sport. So rather than just, a business thinking, how do I just make money with the current business model, or government just worrying about, regulation, they need to proactively enter that space and think, how do I operate with other actors to really unlock these systems? The second thing I think is that needs to happen is, I think we do need transparency into pricing externalities, because at the moment, and that's sort of jargon for the negative or positive effects beyond financial, so particularly social and environmental. Otherwise, two things happen. One is we have continuity bias. So we think that we essentially have huge sort of strategic blind spots because we're not transitioning fast enough. And the second thing is we can't map and understand where the opportunities lie, because we know they're there, but we can't then monetize and put the cases forward, and for the finances then kick in and unlock those opportunities. So I think they're the two things. So that's kind of proactive engagement of stakeholders, and then sort of that transparency and pricing in of those externalities.
We can't have a conversation about data without talking about privacy. Thank you. Thomas, would you like to start, and then maybe we can come to David?
Sure, I'll try to give it a go. I mean, this is a very technical topic, and it can very quickly become also regional. We have been working on the topic of privacy as a foundation for data sharing. We think that it's basically a principle. There, you start to branch out on a couple of themes. First is, what is the current regulatory framework? And we know that in Europe, there is quite some stringent regulations related to private data protection. And we always believe that leveraging this kind of minimum standards is the way forward. But we also believe that within the governances that we've been talking about before, we need to establish a level of control that is either third party or at least has a little bit of an auditing role on how the data is collected, how is it aggregated, and how is it used. Because very often privacy concerns emerge not just in the way we collect data, but in the way we aggregate data, and we therefore use them. So this would be my three cents contribution. I'm not completely technical on the privacy, but that to embrace the minimum standard that is available by regulation or by standards. Secondly, is to make sure that the governance has a control body that is evaluating and auditing a little bit what's done.
And could you just, to the first part of the gentleman's question, which was a bit around the type of data that we're talking about here, in your world, in transit mobility, what sort of data are we talking about?
Yes, thanks. I couldn't hear the question.
That's okay. I'm going to start repeating them.
That's all right. So in the transit and the mobility world, I think we have basically seen quite an evolution over the last 3 years from public authorities or even private sector basically asking all the data available on a certain type of mobility service, from origin and to destination, to the price, to the distance, and then any sort of details that is available depending on the mode, depending on the moment of the day, etc. And we have now evolved into a moment where we start to see a lot more, I would say, sharpness in the requests for data that are being made, so that indeed by default, almost by design, privacy is protected, so that you don't always ask for all the data that is available based on that service or that provider in a city, but you actually surgically go and ask for the data that you need as a private operator or as a public-private group of people that want to share data to achieve a certain purpose. So we believe in this principle of designing your data requirements for a certain purpose.
And that data minimization principle, of course, being at the heart of privacy by design. That's great. Thank you so much. David, can we come to you just to repeat the question, which was a two-parter? Firstly, what sorts of data are we talking about in a proposition like Ecolytics, and how do you protect privacy and make sure that consumers are in control of that sharing process?
I think there are two sides of it. First of all, it's the consumer side. So obviously, privacy is absolutely key, and we shouldn't expose anything that is private data. But even an anonymized form is already helpful. So if we know roughly, how many consumers are going to a grocery store, when this is happening, and how they're distributed, you can use that to actually check some studies that has been done earlier, and cross-check if their assumptions they have done actually accurate, right? Because still, if you look at some studies, they're still done very manually. So they've asked maybe 100 consumers and then extrapolate the number. But if you could do it from, let's say, from a Visa perspective, saying, you know what, we know a lot of grocery transactions, let's do it the other way around. It does not expose any consumer information. It's just looking at a category level. And that's already very helpful for the scientific community. But the other way around, I think it's for businesses. So when I go to as a consumer to a business, I often want to know how sustainable is the business, or do they do anything in that area, etc. And if I'm a large business and maybe stock listed, I have to do some reporting, scope 1, scope 3, whatever. But they only reflect, how I operate my business, not really how good are my products. So we still need to share things like, if for example, if a company and I produces pens, and I do an assessment around it, because next year, I need to even provide sustainability reports for my banks in order to get a loan. Why not share it? Why not share how I actually, how much energy I use, what kind of materials I use, where I source them from, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously on the level that it's maybe not compromising with my competitors, but at least that we know how a usual pan is producing how much energy. Because again, it's a limited factor, because we have maybe 1 or 2 studies done from 1 or 2 producers. And we need those information on a large scale to actually making sure that those assumptions that we had at the end are actually accurate. So I think it depends on where you are. You can share a lot of information without having a privacy issue.
Thank you. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. This gentleman was waiting.
Yes, I was. There's so many questions.
Good.
Kind of keep it short. So obviously, there's the idea that sounds really great about all of this, and what can we really do to push action and force action? Does it need government interaction? I know you're talking about regulation and policy and stuff like that, but do we need a task force on it? Is there integration with potential carbon, a carbon tax, and then a sustainability and efficiency taxation, or is it the same thing? I guess talking about the pens cost environmentally kind of brings that into my mind.
I think that's a great question. I'm going to come to you, Ben, on that, and perhaps afterwards to Thomas, because both of you your organizations are expert in coalition building and engaging with policymakers and regulators. So do we need a task force? Can we integrate this into the existing coalitions that we have today? How do we move forward for real action?
I think there are a couple of levels. I think there is at a global level externalities, because the challenge is that we operate obviously with global capital, but regional regulation largely being set. And that's where a lot falls between the cracks, which is why things like the COP26 conference later this year is so important to get global alignment. We're seeing that on carbon. We've probably closely followed by biodiversity. So I think we need that at the global level to agree what the outcome goals are and pricing in those externalities. I think then, as Tom had mentioned, you've very quickly become into sort of at the system level, whether that's say like energy and then at a regional level, certainly national, often regional level. And I think that's where there is a real need for partners to play that coordination role. And there's I think a lack of actually, really great coalition. There are some that are playing that role. Thomas mentioning some in mobility. So very quickly you get that level where it is important to bring, whether it's task forces, but a coordination role, almost saying what a role are different players on the team going to play? Absolutely. And that looks very different for different sectors, different geographies, but I'm sure Tom has something to maybe add.
Yeah. I'll pick up your examples, Ben, on the carbon transparency. So the World Business Council is launching a cross-industry carbon transparency initiative with the ambition to help companies who are the emitters of the world to provide better transparency on Scope 3, which is really where I would say the rubber hits the ground. So that's one typical project that is of global nature that will be driven by sectors and have impacts globally, but also locally, because as soon as you can measure, obviously you can address and you can react. Another example of coalitions or actions that we can take collectively is the work that we are doing in transport, where we believe that we are in urgent need to move the narrative beyond electrification and to bring the topic of digitalization to the forefront of policymakers. Because as I said, electrification, the challenge is basically huge, and we have to have a kind of a second parallel stream of work. It will not be enough to only look at electrification, and digitalization is that tool that is available to achieve the additional efficiency that we need. So again, the World Business Council, with our members from OEMs to digital solution providers, but also planners and others, we are about to launch this project where we want to create this mobility, or the digital mobility coalition, that is aiming at leveraging data sharing for sustainable mobility. And there we will find solutions like mobility as a service, which is already, by the way, very well advanced with the Mass Alliance. There's a lot to be done also on goods. So the point there is that these coalitions are existing, and we're trying to harness the industry voice so that we can then go to policymakers and support their job, which is damn difficult on this topic, to regulate, to create those policies that will help the data sharing become the norm, so to say.
I'm afraid I promised one more question, and I'm looking at a flashing sign here that says your time is up. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thanks to everyone listening online. Thanks to our brilliant audience. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.